Today we're going to talk about embedding small objects. I'm going to go over a little bit on paper, but that will be a separate show. Today we're just going to be working on objects. So out here I have an array of just some different objects that you could possibly embed, and you can see that they kind of run the gamut from the organic, like feathers. We've got some paper out here just because I wanted to show you. I've got patterns, which I keep a box of. Sorry, I have paint on my fingers. So a box of patterns. I keep maps. One of my favorite papers to embed is tar paper. It's the same stuff that goes on your rooftop, and it has some really beautiful bleeding effects. But again, like I said, we're not going to be talking so much about paper today. String is one of my favorite objects to embed. This is a metallic string, which when you scrape it back, you can actually see the shine of the string. You can embed things like metal. This is just some sort of strange metal washer. Pieces of wood, anything from seed beads to larger beads. Those work as well, and I have even bigger ones than this. You can embed things that you've already created with the encaustic medium. This is just a little rolled up piece of pattern paper that I then coated with a little bit of the white encaustic paint. These are actual seeds, not really seeds, but these are crushed apricot pits, which are give you really beautiful texture, and if it's against a light background you can see the little speckles. It has a really great effect. So today I'm going to walk you through embedding things like this peacock feather, the apricot seeds, and I'm going to also do the metallic string. So let me clear this stuff away, and I'm going to just show you a few examples of how things look in a finished painting. You can do all sorts of different effects once the once the object is secured to your board. You have a lot of options and how you either build texture or color around that object. There's lots of different options. So I'm about ready here to show you some examples. So the first example I have is actually one that one of my students is working on. And this is one with some of the larger beads. They're similar to these. These are beads that I purchased in Turkey. My husband is Turkish, and so we used to go there frequently. Right now we're kind of on a standstill, but hopefully we'll get back there soon. But this is the same kind of bead. You can see the similar size, and she opted to go ahead and cover those beads with the wax. And so you can choose to do that. Like I said, you have lots of options when you're embedding. She chose to cover them with the paint. She could have scraped back and shown the bead as well. So this is student work. These are just some with paper on them. This is a series that I'm working on right now with book paper. This is Hebrew, from a Hebrew historical fiction book that I'm working with. And so you can see that the paper is completely embedded and totally flush with the surface. This is an example of the tar paper. There we go. So this one I didn't do as much bleeding on, but you can see how the wax embeds itself in the paper. And had I not scraped back this area, you could have seen more of the bleeding that can occur. I didn't superfuse it, meaning I didn't hold my torch over it for a long period of time because I knew that that was not the effect that I was going for. But you can see how beautiful that is, in contrast with the encaustic paint. This is another example of embedding. This is a painting that is called Beautiful Scars, and I painted it in 2018. This is part of my kintsugi series, and kintsugi is a Japanese tradition of filling broken pottery and objects, filling the cracks with gold, silver, bronze, any kind of valuable metal. And what their tradition tells them is that the crack is that object's history, and they celebrate history. That history is part of that object now. So my series focuses on how we treat ourselves, and when we have things that are going wrong in our lives or things that we see as flaws, how do we show that to the world, and do we fill it with something precious, or do we make it even ickier? So that's what that whole series is about. And this is a painting of that series. So in here you can see that there are small pegs. These are small wooden pegs that have been embedded in the wax. And this is raffia. So similar, just exactly the same as you would use for wrapping a gift or whatever. And I have all sorts of bags full of, this is my kind of string bag. And then I also have, large containers like this. This has wood pieces in it. Oops, there goes one. And this one has leaves and dried flower petals. So organic stuff is great, and you can totally use flowers or pressed leaves or whatever. But the main thing with that is that you need to make sure that those items are completely dry. You may have an issue later on if they are not dry with mold, because remember that wax encapsulates and preserves what's underneath it. And so if there's any kind of moisture that's caught under there, that would be icky. So we don't want to do that. All right, so there's that one. So the little pieces of wood that I was talking about that are in that plastic bin, this is one of them. And these are just little cuttings, if you will, off of a stick or something. And I painted on top of them and then embedded it in as part of the painting. This is a fun, I've got you upside down. So this one is a bunny rabbit, and the rabbit is actually wax. And you can see how far it stands off of the board. It's probably about, on its deepest, probably about 3/4 of an inch or so. But the rabbit literally just, it was a really easy process to get this to adhere to the board because its material is very similar to the encaustic paint. So this one is called Unexpected, and it has a tongue depressor, which is wood, and small nails embedded into it. And so the metal objects obviously are a little bit more challenging because they absorb all of that heat from your torch or your heat gun, but they do stay there. And the smaller metal objects, you really don't need to worry so much about securing them other than by using the paint. So the wooden objects, of course, they work great. I'm going to just turn on more lights here. I forgot to turn on my overheads. Hopefully this will help you see more clearly. A little brighter now. So those are that. And then here's an example of the string. So this is the metallic string that's running through this painting. It has lots of different layers. I started with a watercolor on board and built up from there. The color that you're seeing underneath the string is the watercolor, and you can kind of see it in between the cracks of the stones that I created here. And this is all stencil work. So just beautiful lines that you can achieve with the metallic string. It could be ribbon, it could be raffia, it could be any other kind of string, yarn, all sorts of options. I've seen a lot of people use embroidery thread. And so then here is just a last example. Since we're going to be using a peacock feather, I wanted to go ahead and bring this painting out for you as well. This one already has the peacock feather embedded into the paint. And then what I wanted to achieve with this painting is I really wanted to have the glow of the feathers showing. What happens is when you embed things that are shiny or have beautiful color, the paint, the encaustic paint, whether it's the clear encaustic medium or a colored pigmented paint, it'll dull those colors. And so I went back in, did some carving to define line, and then added some metallic with some dry pigment. And that's how I got that color kind of back in there. But you can see the texture when I run it across the light there. So again, so I just want to remind everyone that if you're working with encaustic, you want to make sure that your space is safe. So you'll want to be in an area where you have a lot of ventilation, either by opening windows with a cross breeze or setting your encaustic paint by a window with a fan blowing out. Or if you're using a ventifume, that works great too. But just make sure that you're working safely with your encaustic medium and your encaustic paint. Some of the other materials that you'll need for this are a heat gun or a torch, multiple size torches here that I have. These are both butane torches. I also like to work with my smaller ones just for more detailed fusing. Some people prefer to work with a heat stylus. That will work as well with the little iron shaped head on it. So that is an option as well. If you're working with paper, you'll need things like wax paper and a burnishing tool. Again, that'll be a different show, but I just wanted to show you those materials. And then of course, if you're working with larger items, you will need to use some sort of a glue or secure it with wire or brads or something like that. The glues that can be used ahead of time, you can use a little bit of like Gorilla Glue or super glue. E6000 is another one that a lot of encaustic artists use. Obviously, if you're just using something small like paper and you really want to, like, say you want to secure it to the board first before you start to paint, you could go ahead and use Yes Paste or Mod Podge or something like that to get it. Wood glue would work great. So any of those would be great options. So let's see, we've gone through our supplies and let's go ahead and get going with the demo. We're going to go ahead and start with the crushed apricot seeds because I like to use these when I'm starting a new background, and it's just a really beautiful way to start building more color and decide how those crushed apricots are going to embellish my painting. So I'm just going to take these out of the box, and you can see they're very, very fine. Sorry about the paint. I was messing with stuff earlier. So they're really, really fine. So I want to make sure that I'm using them in a really controlled way and keeping them in the bag until I absolutely need to use them. But what I want to do first, I've gone ahead, and this board has already been treated with clear encaustic medium, about 3 layers, but I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to just add one more layer and heat it. If you have several layers of encaustic paint on your board already, you just want to make sure that your surface is going to be nice and warm to take in the whatever it is that you are embedding. So I'm going to go ahead and use it. I hope you guys have had time to be creative out there and work on some new projects. Maybe now you'll add on to your project by embedding some objects. So you can see this is still cooling a little bit. I hold my hand over the top and I can feel the heat. Even while it's in this really warm, kind of smushy state, I can go ahead and either pour the seeds into my hand and kind of scatter them that way. You can see they're just really, really subtle, or I could opt to do a little bit more by dropping them directly out of the bag. And you can see when I drop them out of the bag, they get really kind of clumpy, but I can also move them around because I haven't done anything to directly push them into the board yet. I'm going to go ahead and put a few more on there. So now that they're on the warm paint, go ahead and put this back. So don't want these scattered all over my studio. Then I'm actually going to go ahead and use a technique that's really similar to how you would embed the paper. So I'm going to go ahead and tear off a little bit of the wax paper. And I'm going to, before I go into fusing or painting, if I painted on this right now, my paintbrush would just pick up those little granules of apricot pit and it would go back into my paint and I would destroy my paint. So I don't want to do that. What I want to do is I want to go ahead and lay this over the top of my crushed apricot seed and push them down into the warm wax. So I'm applying a fair amount of pressure here. You don't want to just gently rub it, otherwise they're just kind of roll around underneath your wax paper. I'm going to add a fair amount of pressure and make sure that you get the whole surface of your board. I see I've got some excess here. I'm just going to brush that away. And just make sure that they're pushed in there nicely. You might want to be careful about how you pull up your wax paper. Sometimes if your encaustic paint is too warm or you push too hard, it'll stick. I'm just going to kind of move this around a little bit and just make sure that I've got them nicely pushed down into the surface. So once I'm sure that we're good and stuck on there, I will just kind of run my hand over the top, or you could shake it just to make sure that nothing's coming off of there. But you can see how beautiful that is. I'm sitting here thinking, I'm like, wouldn't it be incredible to maybe give a metallic shine to some of the crushed apricot seeds as well? That would be really cool. But that's also something you could do later on. So then I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to paint a little bit of the encaustic medium over the top to seal those in, and then I'll fuse it. You might see, so I'm going across this pretty quickly. If I chose, I could maybe hang out over the top of the apricot seeds and maybe make them move around a little bit. You can see them slightly shifting. I want to keep this a fairly smooth surface area though, and now that I have the apricot seeds embedded in there, I'm not going to do a lot of shifting because that'll make my surface uneven and make it maybe a little harder if I wanted to later on embed paper, that sort of thing. So I want a nice smooth surface. Not to say that I couldn't do some scraping, but because this is my very first layer, this apricot seed, if I scrape, chances are I'm going to scrape up some of the apricot seed as well. So I don't want to do that because I just put it down. All right, so there's the apricot seed, and you can see that it's kind of clouding here, but it's still really warm. So a lot of that clouding will disappear as the paint cures. The next object that I am going to embed is a peacock feather. And this one you can see is just really beautiful, has that beautiful green sheen with the yellows and blues, and it's even got some purple down here. It's just gorgeous. And what I'm going to do is I have two boards here, and for this painting I'm going to do something really similar with the apricot seeds over here, and I'm going to run a continuation. I have the come here, so it will eventually look something like this. So there will be a continuation of the two boards. We're going to work on this one that you can see really well, and I'm going to try and get as much of this feather in as I possibly can. So since this is just a really small, thin object, I have some options here. I can choose to put this object, because it's organic, it's not going to melt, it's not going to absorb heat like a metal object will. So I could put this on my hot plate and drizzle a little bit of the clear encaustic medium over the top of it to get it to maybe absorb some of that paint before I burnish it onto my board. Or I could just use the heat that's already coming off of the board and burnish it just like I did the apricot seed. So those are two different options. Sometimes I will take an organic item and try to get it to absorb paint beforehand, just to really ensure a really good bond. But a lot of times, especially with something this thin, tissue paper, patterns, anything thicker than a pattern, I would probably put on my heating plate first. But this is so thin and fragile. I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to use the same technique that I used with and you can see I can even just use my hand and press it down into that warm wax. So I'm going to get it kind of settled. And of course, the thicker part being the middle part of the feather. So that is part that I'm really going to want to make sure is pushed down nicely. So I have a few, so I don't know if you can see this, maybe on this screen. So when I burnished the apricot seed, I have some areas of the wax paper that you can clearly see have been used. I can still utilize that, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip it over, because sometimes, because that touches your wax surface, sometimes it gets sticky. So I'm going to go ahead and use the same wax paper, not to waste. And I'm going to start with that center. I don't know what the center part of a feather is called. Does anybody know what that's called? I should look that up. And I'm going to use a different kind of stroke as I burnish it into my wax, rather than that kind of furious rubbing. I'm going to try and run my pressure along the same direction as the feather, just to make sure that it's nice and connected with the paint on the board before I start doing my furious rubbing, which always follows. And the rule of burnishing, if you've ever taken one of my classes, you know that the rule of burnishing is rub, 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 and when you think you're done, rub some more. Because burnishing is a really important part of a lot of different techniques with encaustic. And we always think we're done before we are. And it's just really super important to get it to bond. So I'm going to rub a little bit more than I have there. But you can see, maybe from the edge, that it is lying really nicely flush with the board. But I'm just going to rub a little bit more to make sure that, especially like I said, that kind of thicker stem of the feather, and then those areas that are closest to that ridge, because those areas will want to stand up. All right. So once you feel like you've got a pretty nice bond, you can go ahead and use your encaustic medium. So I'm going to go ahead and use a clear encaustic medium again, and you will see this color will almost immediately disappear. It will not be shiny like this anymore. So those are things that I'm going to have to coax out later, but I just want to show you how. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to just run the encaustic medium against the edge of that thicker part so that it starts to build up. If I rubbed alongside it, I wouldn't necessarily be getting the greater amount of the paint against the object. So I want it to really take on more paint there. So you can see I painted the whole board. You could opt just to paint the object that you've just embedded as well. You don't need to paint the whole board. I'm looking for a more consistent, and I can go back in later and I will be doing some scraping anyway. So I'm gonna go ahead and use this one. So you can see I haven't even fused it yet, but all of that beautiful sheen and color gone, just like that. And you might see it pop a little bit when I go to fuse it, but it will disappear again as the paint settles and cools. I do want to be careful because this is an organic material. I don't want to fuse too long because I could alter my effect in the sense of rather than getting the paint to be absorbed by the object, I could actually set it on fire, which is not what I want to do. So I have a couple of little feathers here hanging off the edge and that sort of thing, and I can take care of that with a straight edge razor later. I'm just going to go ahead and leave it for now. So this is nicely and firmly embedded into the paint. I will probably do at least another layer of clear encaustic medium over the top, which I'll go ahead and do now. And this time I'm going to kind of do a different direction. And the reason that I'm putting more on there is to add depth to my paint so that when I do go in there to carve and define line and layers, I'm not actually carving through and releasing the feather that I've worked so hard to embed. So I'm going to go ahead and fuse that again. So sometimes you'll see, especially with paper and sometimes with feathers, like I said, with that thicker stem area of the feather, sometimes it'll want to like lift up a little bit. So I always recommend that you have a small tool handy, like this is a dental pick, but you could use any kind of, any kind of all-shaped tool to kind of, mine's not lifting, but you could just use it to kind of push it down. So that works, and you can even push it down while you're fusing, or if you're really having problems with it lifting, I would recommend using this small little iron on the heat stylus. And you can learn more about the heat stylus in The Heat is On, which is one of my videos that goes over a lot of the heating tools used with Encaustic. So that is the feather. And you can see, like, I will definitely be using these dental tools again later to go ahead and, carve those lines just like I did in this painting. Right, so I'll be going in later on and adding those metallics, re-adding the color. Time consuming, but so pleasurable, and it brings you joy, just kind of I can't think today. Anyway, it just adds a burst of its natural color and shape again into the object. So just breathes new life in there. So the paint is still really warm, so I don't want to mess with it too much, but I'm getting a nice little sheen here, which is super cool. And I'm now going to go ahead and show you how to embed string. We have about 9 minutes left here. So where did my string go? A little unorganized here. Oh, there it is, just sitting there. So I'm going to go ahead and embed string. I love string. It's so much fun to work with. So normally what I'll do is I'll get a nice overextended length of string, and I will use a pair of scissors to cut it, even though it is larger than the board itself. I want it to extend over the edges because it's a lot easier to work with it over here than it is, you know, over here. I was doing the wrong hand, mirror image. So over here, I have a lot more use of this hand and moving it around and trying to figure out how I want this string to be embedded into the painting. Oh, that's kind of cool, kind of at an angle. So I'm going to go ahead and put my scissors away and the rest of the string. Now this metallic string obviously is not organic, and I have not had any issues with it melting, but it does catch on fire very easily. So I want to be very careful and make sure that number one, I'm able to really push it down into the surface area first, and also then get a really nice layer of the encaustic paint on top of it. So I'm going to go ahead and do this angle. I really like the way this works. My paint, like I said, is really warm, and so it won't take much for me to, well, that side worked pretty good. This one, there we go. And I want to stretch it. I want to make sure that it's nice and straight, and the way that I'm going to be able to do that is by stretching the string as tight as I can across the surface. And then once it's down there, I'm going to go ahead and use my wax paper again and the burnishing tool, and I'm going to push it down into the surface, burnishing using pressure. I'm not worried about these pieces that are hanging off the edge, but what I am kind of doing is rubbing it into this edge to make sure that it is nice and solidly sitting there. If I only rub to this edge, chances are as I fuse, that string's going to creep up, it'll catch fire, it'll change the way that the object looks. Okay, so this again, even though I'm pushing this down into the surface area, it's still a raised edge. So I do want to make sure to rub on all sides of the string. Oh, love, love, love. And if you rub your finger across the string just to ensure that it is embedded into your surface area, it'll kind of feel like if you ever run your fingers across wood that has embedded pieces in it, tile or other pieces of wood, you can kind of feel the seams. That's kind of what it feels like. So I'm going to go ahead and run my encaustic medium over the top. Again, not worrying about these edges over here. I might even do a little bit more on the sides there. It'll all run off when I fuse, so I'm not too worried about buildup. So there I've got my first layer of encaustic medium over the string. Go ahead and fuse it. Be real careful of those edges so that I don't fry my object. That would be bad. And they are very sensitive, so I have to be really, really sure that I'm not getting close to it. You can, well, I didn't. Sometimes I'll just singe it a little bit, but I guess I was really careful. So now that I've got that layer, I'm barely touching it, but it's becoming much more flush with the surface. As I cover it with the clear encaustic medium, just like with the feather, that shine will start to disappear. You can see really clearly in this position how it barely shines. If I lift it, you can see that it is still shiny. But the more layers, obviously, that I put on here, the dimmer that metallic string will get. But the nice thing about string is because it's such a thin little line, is that later on I can go in with a scraping tool, either probably something a little wider than my dental tool, but I can go in there and scrape that line, and that metallic just will shine right back up, and your viewer won't even realize that you've carved into the painting. So these are 3 great examples of how to embed small objects, and you can see I used the encaustic medium as the glue. I didn't need to add wood glue or D6000 or anything like that. And then I just wanted to point out that on these edges here, you can see I would obviously not keep these strings here. For right now, I would just probably clip them with the scissors and get as close to the edge as possible to do that. You can see it's still kind of hanging over. Sometimes you can just bend it down and embed it into the very edge of your painting. Other times, I'm not going to do it now because this is still really warm, but you could flip over your painting and lay it on a clean surface and then just take a straight edge razor alongside your painting, and that area would get trimmed right off before you do the full scraping and clean up your edges and do whatever you do to your edges. So there we've got some really nice effects. I could go and continue to add more layers. There's no limit to how much you can embed onto your paintings. You can embellish it with more paint. You can embellish it with oil pastel, crayon d'acier, graphite, ink, alcohol ink. I mean, don't get me started. Encaustic is just endless fun. So I hope that you've enjoyed the show today and that you have learned something new, and or maybe